everyone, and welcome back to another video. So just over a month ago now, and I know I'm late with the story, it's not been a good month for me, but I'm working through it. We're doing okay now. This is all good. But just about a month ago, a school board in Tennessee voted to remove Art Spiegelman's book Mouse from its language arts curriculum. Mouse being a graphic novel published over 40 years ago now, telling the story of his parents' and family's experience during the Holocaust. Now, before we jump into this video and get started, I was forget to mention this stuff. So if you're new here, it would be great if you subscribe because it really helps me and means a lot. And if you like this video, it would be great if you leave a like, leave a comment, share the video around on social media, because that all helps me keep making even more videos for you guys. Also, if you want to go follow me over on Instagram, I've recently got back into painting Warhammer minis, like this amazing little chaos demon right here, who I am super proud of. I spent so much time on him and I absolutely loved it. And I tried these new techniques where I used like modeling paste to extend the base and added extra lava and all sorts of stuff like that. It had all these new painting techniques I've not tried before, and it's my biggest project to date, so I'm really proud of him. So if you want to go see the like progress pictures for him, as well as the finished kind of final photos, you can go see them over on my Instagram, which is just Rachel Oates with a 0 instead of an O because my name was taken, and you can see the mini painting highlights and see some progress photos of him and a couple of my other projects. So yeah, I'm really proud of that. I'm really excited. I just wanted to share it with you before we jump into the video, so thank you. So let's talk about Mouse. So in my opinion, the book is incredible. I first read it maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, I want to say, and I found it so moving, but at the same time educational, because it painted this side of the Holocaust that we don't really get to see all that much in media. There's a lot of books about people's experience during the Holocaust, and there's like a lot of documentaries and textbooks and stuff like that, but this was there in pictures in front of you. It was real, and it was not only the experience during the Holocaust, but the aftermath afterwards and how it affected the family even in future generations, and kind of had this like knock-on effect for years. And I thought that was it was an important thing to show, and I'm really glad they did. This is one of the first books that I recommend to people when they ask me like where to get started with graphic novels and comics, because I think it's something that everyone should read and that everyone will get something out of. And I'm absolutely not the only person who thinks like this, because the book has won like a Pulitzer Prize and a bunch of other stuff, and it's been a bestseller for like 40 years now, and it absolutely deserves the hype that's around it, you know? So up until last month, in some schools in Tennessee, it was being taught as part of their language arts curriculum, which I guess is kind of our equivalent of like maybe English Lit or something like that. And it was being taught to grade 8s, which in the UK is our year 9s, which is kids around the age of 14. So this is the age that I'm pretty sure I studied the Holocaust sort of in depth in school, but we did it in history. It's an age where kids are really starting to mature and grow up a little bit and starting to form their own opinions about things. They don't really need to be babied in classes anymore. They deserve to be taught as equals and asked their opinion and presented with these quite adult topics. Well, not even adult topics, but these real, sometimes dark topics. I think they deserve to be presented with those and be allowed to make up their own minds about them. And I think a big part of that is making sure you teach them through mediums they can actually connect with, which is why I think teaching them through graphic novels is a really interesting and good and useful way of doing it. A while back now, I made a video about classic literature with 1-star reviews, and it was meant to be just a kind of like a silly, light-hearted, fun video. I'll link it in the description if you want to check it out, and I'll pop a little thing on screen as well. And one of the things I noticed was that a lot of the negativity came from kids and young people who were saying, we were made to read this in school and I just don't get it. And it's because they just didn't connect with the book. They didn't connect with maybe the time or the setting or the scenarios. They were all alien to them. And so in that case, I think it's perfectly understandable why they didn't really like the books. But a book like Mouse is fantastic because it's a graphic novel, so it's not too daunting or intimidating to get started with, no matter what your reading level. It's not dry. It's basically a story of a family and their relationship with each other during one of the most horrific periods of history, and how that affects even later generations. So it's something that I think a lot of kids will connect with and see themselves in, not because of the Holocaust part, but because of the family part and the relationships part. It takes something kind of big and almost abstract like the Holocaust and something that's quite alien to us now, and it helps people really understand what it must have been like and how awful it was by putting characters that we recognize today into the story, like your mother, your father, your family, you know? It's no longer just a dry subject in an old textbook. It becomes real to them, and that's what's really important about teaching subjects like the Holocaust, is that it becomes real and they connect with it and they understand just why it was so wrong and how bad it was. But apparently this Tennessee school board doesn't agree, because reasons. They said they removed it from the curriculum because, and I quote, of its unnecessary use of profanity and nudity and depiction of violence and suicide, and they hope to replace it with other works which teach children about the historical and moral lessons and realities of the Holocaust in a more age-appropriate fashion. Except that's ridiculous. The Holocaust was horrific. There's no way you can sanitize it and make it child-friendly. It wasn't a child-friendly period of history. It was a horrific event, and even children deserve to understand that and learn about it. If you sanitize it, if you clean it up, they don't understand just how bad it was. And that's a really, really bad miscommunication. That can lead to really, really bad ways of thinking for these kids as they grow up. The passages in question that made them want to ban this book include one small drawing of a naked woman committing suicide in the bath. It was Art's mother who couldn't cope with life after what she faced in the concentration camps and took her own life. It's a really heartbreaking part of the story and the book. It's not depicted too graphically, it's not gruesome, it's not glorified or romanticized or glamorized in any way. It's just a very small panel with a very emotive event happening in it. There's also another scene of prisoners drawn as mice being made to strip off their clothes as they entered one of the concentration camps. Because that's the other thing I should mention as well. In near enough every part of this book, every character is depicted as an animal. So you have like cats and mice rather than like human beings. So when we talk about nudity, other than the one scene with the mother, every naked body is a mouse. So that's worth mentioning. There's, I think, one instance of someone saying damn. I did skip through the book and kind of like reread passages and reread bits of it and tried to kind of like find what was causing offense, and I couldn't find many like instances of swearing at all. So maybe there's a couple more, but it's not like this is littered on every page with like F words and C words and God knows what else, you know? And then there are a couple of images of mice being hung and mouse bodies being piled up in mass graves, which, yeah, it's horrible, but it's not glorifying anything, it's not romanticizing anything, it's not sexualizing nudity at all, it's not even excessive or making up a large part of the book, but it is absolutely real and it's absolutely what happened, and therefore I do think they deserve to be portrayed in this book. A drawing of a naked mouse and maybe a few minor swear words here and there don't detract from anyone understanding how horrific the Holocaust was, but you simply cannot sanitize something as horrific as genocide and expect it to still have the same impact. The Nazis would often strip prisoners naked as a way of dehumanizing and torturing them. To show this isn't unnecessary or sexualized or inappropriate nudity, it's showing the horrific reality of the situation. And it's one thing to tell kids, yeah, they were dehumanized, blah, blah, blah. It's another to show them exactly how that happened and how bad it was, and for them to see the harsh realities and understand that this was not okay. This is something that we can never allow to happen again. There is violence and suicide in the book because the real life Holocaust was incredibly violent and inevitably led to a lot of suicide and murder and all kinds of death. To sanitize this stuff is to downplay it. Once you allow them to see these things happening to characters which they can relate to, which they built a connection with, which is what Mouse does, it makes it so much more powerful to them. It really drives the message home. It makes sure they don't forget it. It makes sure they really understand it. Books like Mouse teach these periods of history in a way that no textbook ever can, because they make it real. They give kids that emotional, and adults, all readers really, that emotional connection to what happened in the past. So board member Tony Ullman justified his part in removing the book by saying, being in the schools, educators and stuff, we don't need to enable or somewhat promote this stuff. It shows people hanging. It shows them killing kids. Why does the educational system promote this kind of stuff? It's not wise or healthy, except it's not enabling or promoting that stuff at all. It's heavily, heavily, heavily criticizing it. It's showing the dark, horrible reality and saying, hey, let's not let this happen again. It's not showing kids being killed to say, oh, wasn't this a lovely time? Oh, remember all those deaths? No, it's exactly the opposite. The only people you're protecting by hiding this stuff and sanitizing this stuff and downplaying this stuff and not showing the true realities of how bad it was, the only people you're protecting there are actual Nazis. The US Holocaust Museum released a statement on Twitter in response to this whole thing, which I completely agree with. They said, teaching about the Holocaust using books like Mouse can inspire students to think critically about the past and their own roles and responsibilities today. Good on them for saying this. I know back many years ago now when I was a kid in school. Like 14 was over half my life ago now. I feel so old. But back when I was in school and learned about the Holocaust, when you read about it in textbooks and just got like numbers quoted to you, it all felt very abstract. It felt like a long time ago. It felt very distant, you know? None of it feels real until you learn about the actual real people who were involved and hurt and abused and killed and who were affected by this period of history. And reading about it in textbooks didn't help me understand that, but fiction really did. Books like The Book Thief and The Storyteller and Mouse played a huge part in helping me understand what the Holocaust was really like for people and how horrific it was and how bad those atrocities were. Another big thing for me was going to the Holocaust Memorial and Museum when I was in Berlin, when I was maybe 21, I want to say, something like that, and it was to this day one of like the most heartbreaking experiences I've had in terms of something that didn't happen to me, you know, because it was being there a genuinely like difficult and very emotional experience. It's a beautiful memorial. I think it does an amazing job of helping you remember and understand, and the museum is incredible. And if anyone's in Berlin, I thoroughly recommend you go. I remember in particular there's this one room that's just like pitch black, and you sit in it and it has voices reading out letters and diary entries from people at the time with little projections of like their words and faces moving around the walls, and you sit there in this dark room hearing their stories and understanding that they were real people. And that like, it just made it very real. And I remember I was sat in that room with one of my friends who was always kind of like this sort of like upbeat, silly, funny guy in the group, you know, the one that like was never really too serious about anything. And I was sat there with him, and I just turned around and looked at him, and I've never seen him so serious. He was close to tears, and we just kind of like looked at each other, and like, yeah, it was a lot. Like, I've never seen him that emotional before or since, and it was just I think it was something that really affected all of us, you know, because there was, I don't know, maybe 15 of us that went that day, and like we all just came out and like walked away in silence. It was a lot. Anyway, not everyone on the school board was like Tony. A few people actually made some sense. In that same school board meeting, instructional supervisor Julie Gooden argued, "I was a history teacher and there is nothing pretty about the Holocaust. And for me, this was a great way to depict a horrific time in history," speaking about Mouse, the book. While another instructional supervisor there argued, "I think the author is portraying that because it's a true story about his father that lived through that. He is trying to portray the best he can with the language that he chooses that would relate to that time, maybe to help people who haven't been in that aspect in time to actually relate to the horrors of it." And I thoroughly agree with these two. I think they make excellent points, but sadly it wasn't enough to stop anyone else from voting to ban it. Ullman then countered with, "I'm not denying it was horrible, brutal and cruel. It's like when you're watching TV and a cuss word or nude scene comes on, it would be the same movie without it. Well, this would be the same book without it." To which I absolutely have to disagree. He could not be more wrong. Sure, there are some books or films or media out there which uses violence or nudity gratuitously. Absolutely, that happens. But there are also plenty that don't. Mouse isn't a book saying, "Ooh, look, some cool guys killing someone. Aren't guns cool?" It's not using nudity to say, "Oh my god, look at this hot girl." It's all done with purpose. Like, for another example, there's a reason why some adults are fine watching like a consensual sex scene in a film, but can't sit there and watch a sexual assault scene in a film. Because one of those things might be gratuitous or fine or, you know, used for one reason. The other is used for another and more emotional reason and with purpose. If you have a film about, I don't know, bird watchers, and then suddenly in the middle you have a sex scene with two adults going at it in a forest, yeah, that's probably gratuitous, and you can take that scene out and it'll still be the same film. But let's imagine you have a film about rape, for example, and you want to show how horrific the rape was and the effect it had on the victim afterwards and their life and so on and so on. In that case, you might want to show the rape scene, to show how bad it was, to show how it affected the character. You might want to use it to kind of like shock the audience and make them understand, oh look, this is a character that I feel for and relate to and care about, and now they're being hurt in this way. So you might want to show, for example, a rape scene or a violent attack scene or some kind of scene like that to make a point. And if you take that out, it won't be the same film because it's put in there for a purpose with a reason. And I think it's the same with Mouse, but you know, not rape, but like violence and murder and so on. Like, you take those things out of the book and it's absolutely not the same book. You're downplaying the seriousness of what happened. You're not showing the realities of it, and that does change the book, and I don't think that's okay. I guess like another example for me would be something like the film This Is England, and by the way, Shane Meadows, absolute genius. If you haven't seen This Is England, thoroughly recommend, it's so good. It's about kind of like skinheads and white supremacists. The 80s, I want to say, is it 80s? Yeah, early 80s, I think. You know, kind of getting involved with like white supremacists, and there's a lot of racism and kind of how that divides communities and so on. And you have this one black character in it called Milky, who you absolutely grow to love throughout the film. He's such a nice guy, and he's so sweet, and he's lovely, and you just like properly grow to love him. And throughout the film, like, you're seeing a bunch of stuff, and you know, the kind of like skinheads are sort of, they kind of get involved with these white supremacists and these racist guys, and there's kind of divides in the group, and you start seeing it and you're like, oh yeah, okay, well, like, I guess racism's pretty bad. They're doing some pretty bad stuff, they're not great guys. And like throughout the film you're kind of thinking like, okay, yeah, cool, they're bad guys, whatever. And then almost out of nowhere at the end of the film, this guy Combo, fueled by like absolute like racism and jealousy, he just turns around and he beats Milky like so badly. Like, it's violent, it's graphic, it's shocking, it's genuinely hard to watch. And you see this character that you've grown to absolutely like love and care for and adore. You see him nearly being killed by another man purely because of rage and racism and hatred. And it's shocking. It's absolutely appalling. It's disgusting. It's, like I say, really, really difficult to watch, but it's not done gratuitously. It's done for a purpose. It's supposed to be hard to watch. It's supposed to disgust you. It's supposed to be shocking, and it's a visual depiction of how disgusting and harmful all racism is. And without that scene in the film, the message of racism is bad wouldn't quite hit home as hard as it does, I don't think. If you take the violence out of that film, it's not the same film, and you're downplaying the seriousness of racism. Just like if you take the violence out of Mouse, it's not the same book, and you're downplaying the seriousness of what happened. And I mean, like, when it comes to This Is England, I studied that film in media studies when I was like 16, so while it's awful and it's shocking, I don't necessarily think it's inappropriate for kids to see. I think it's real, and I think it gets the message across just like Mouse does, you know? Yeah, I don't know, maybe that's just my opinion. So anyway, in response to all this, there was a lot of what I think is justified uproar online. This ban was announced, almost ironically, the day before International Holocaust Remembrance Day, so it definitely got a lot of attention from people. The author Art, who's now in his early 70s, described the ban as Orwellian, which I'm inclined to agree with, and he also claimed that he suspected that its members were motivated less about some mild curse words and more by the subject of the book. This was then backed up by another favourite author of mine, Neil Gaiman, who said, "There's only one kind of people who would vote to ban Mouse, whatever they're calling themselves these days." I think you can tell what's implied there. I'm not going to comment on whether I think that's true or not, or whether I think that's the case or not, but I thought it was worth mentioning. But all this does lead me to ask bigger questions, because this is just one example in the big grand scheme of things. So let's consider, is it ever right to ban a book? Now, my immediate instinct to this was to say no, of course not. But then I got thinking about books, and I got thinking about some of the books that I've actually reviewed on this channel. For example, Michael and Debbie Pearl's book, To Train Up a Child, is basically a guide to child abuse. It has been linked to the deaths of a number of children. It instructs parents on how to hit their child and how to get away with it, how to hide it, how to cover it up, to pull their kids' hair, to trick them into hurting themselves, to push them in ponds, to teach them to be aware of the water. Basically, it's teaching them how to condition kids to obey you without question, and so on. It's a bad book. My argument for not banning any books is that every adult and child should be able to at least listen to other ideas and be taught to critically assess them and make up their own minds about them. But in reality, that's not what always happens, is it? some people, regardless of age, don't have the critical thinking skills required. Some people are going to take a book like To Train Up a Child and just follow it word for word, and in fact many people have. And that's exactly how thousands of children have ended up hurt and abused and with emotional trauma and faced physical trauma, and how a number of children ended up dead. And at that point, when innocent people, innocent children, are being killed because of a book, I have to ask, whose responsibility is it to stop that? And if we can, how do we even do that? If we can say for certain, without this book, those adults would never have got these instructions, which literally led to this child's death, is it A, okay to ban that book, or B, our moral responsibility to ban that book? Or to complicate things more, does context matter? Is it okay to still sell this book, for example, and encourage people to read it only if it's sold in, for example, a history or politics or sociology section of a bookshop, to be an example of like, hey, look, this is what was taught to people. If you want to read it to understand the consequences of what happened and why people did this, then go ahead. In the same way that Mein Kampf might be sold in the history section of bookstores. But if we moved that book to political biographies and held it up as some inspirational read of like, oh, look, wasn't he a great leader? Let's follow his ideas. That would be bad. But I don't think it should be outright banned in terms of its historical significance. I think people should still be able to read it to understand how Germany at that point got to that point and how horrific things happened. The point is, I think context matters. And I think maybe in certain circumstances, it's okay to have a book out there, to sell a book, to provide a book, to allow people to read a book if they know the context going in. But then how can you really ensure that people know the context? That's something we can't really police. How do we know how people are going to interpret it? We can sell Mein Kampf as a historical book if we want, but there's still going to be people who read it and think, God, this guy had some good ideas, didn't he? Let's go back to this. As horrific as that is, just like I can read To Train Up a Child and know, oh, this is really bad, I'll never abuse children. But someone else can come along and read the exact same thing and think, oh, I'm going to try this out on my kid. Whoops, they're dead now. So how do we control the effect that these books have on people? How do we keep people safe from dangerous books? How do we even define what a dangerous book is? Whose responsibility is it to define what a dangerous book is? It's complicated, right? And I mean, there's clearly different levels to this. Like here, there's uproar about kids seeing some naked mice. In my example with the pearls, there's uproar because children were killed. There's a difference there, and that one's maybe more of an obvious option because you're like, oh yeah, death of kids is worse than kids seeing naked mice, absolutely. But what about in that grey area in the middle where it gets more complicated? I don't know. It's very difficult, isn't it? And I mean, the whole topic around censorship in general has been in the news so much recently because of this whole controversy around Joe Rogan, right? So what do we think about musicians threatening to take their music off Spotify if Spotify don't stop promoting Joe Rogan? That is essentially a form of censorship. So what do we think of that? This one I think is more complicated because it's not just a should he be banned or not. I think there's a huge difference between just allowing him a platform to say what he wants on and the insane amounts of promotion that Spotify do. Joe Rogan has been unwillingly shoved down my throat so many times by Spotify that it genuinely annoys me. And I've had to be nope, closing Spotify for a bit because I don't want to see him anymore. It's genuinely annoying. They aren't just allowing him a place to speak, but they're actively hoisting him up and making sure we listen, which is a huge problem when he's clearly spreading so much harmful misinformation. He's literally been fact-checked on air and still refuses to admit he's wrong and change his narrative. And his narrative is focused around anti-vax stuff and spreading terrible COVID misinformation and so on. And I've literally seen people that I thought were smart, intelligent people be convinced by Joe Rogan's absolute BS and start spouting all these government conspiracies and stuff and how they're not going to get vaccinated and blah 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 because Joe Rogan says whatever. The level of influence he has is ridiculous, and the fact that Spotify are, I guess, what would you say, maybe approving of this, they're giving him an air of authenticity. They're saying, yeah, this is someone you should listen to, I do think that's a problem. But to compare it to something like Mouse in this situation, like, we also have to consider that the target audience and actual audience are very, very different for someone like Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan makes his podcast for adults. Most of his audience are adults. And as adults, you should have the critical thinking skills to be able to listen to what he's saying and analyze it and make up your own mind. To tell adults what they can and can't listen to can be unfair. It can be infantilizing. We should, in an ideal world, be able to trust adults to decide what's best for themselves and, you know, do what they want and listen to what they want and consume the media that they want, and trust that they're going to do the right thing with the information that they receive. However, we clearly can't in reality, and that's a problem. As much as the people I'm saying this about will get angry at me for saying this, some people, regardless of their age, regardless of their background, regardless of anything, do not have the level of critical thinking skills required to consume media like Joe Rogan's podcast and not be put in direct harm by it. I know some people won't like me saying that, but it's absolutely true. And not at all to shame the people who don't have those skills. That's not the point here. The point is, if they don't have them, should we be protecting them? Because plenty of people take all the crap that Joe Rogan states as fact. Some people aren't critical of his words, and so they believe his anti-vax nonsense, and that puts themselves and other people at risk because they don't have those skills, and because no one is kind of filtering the content they listen to and consume and believe. Now, people are in danger. Their lives and their healths are in danger. So I guess we have to ask, what's more important? Respectfully treating these people as adults and allowing them to make mistakes which put vulnerable people in danger? Or do we limit what misinformation they have access to, and maybe they feel disrespected or infantilized in some way, but at least they and other people are safe? What's more important there? Which one should we do? Is there a clear-cut answer? Because I don't know. I don't know what's exactly right here. I will say that in this particular case, I'm a little bit biased because I do not like Joe Rogan, and I hate his misinformation, especially around all the vaccine and COVID stuff. So I will say, I do not think Spotify should be promoting him at all, and I would absolutely not be upset if his podcast got removed from Spotify. But that's just me and my little biased opinion. That doesn't mean that would be my answer in all cases. That doesn't mean that's my entire worldview. Just in this one case, I don't give a damn about Joe Rogan. I don't care. And finally, another big question that this whole Mouse situation brings up is, should children ever be shielded from learning about difficult or emotional or dark topics? And this, again, is a question where I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. I don't think it's obvious. Obviously, people want to protect kids as much as possible. That's absolutely fair and understandable and a normal viewpoint, and I thoroughly agree with it, obviously. But sometimes I think kids need to learn about certain topics that can be difficult or emotional or dark or whatever in abstract or fictional ways, in order to understand how to process and deal with them when they experience them in the real world. There's a silly story I sometimes tell when people ask about, you know, like things I experienced as a kid that were way too dark for me or whatever. I always tell this as like a silly story and a joke, and it has like a bit of a punchline and whatever. But I genuinely think there's a really important lesson here. So there's this museum in Leeds, which is like a museum of medicine, and when I was a tiny kid, so we're talking like, I don't know, maybe 6 or something, we went on a school trip there, and it was exactly the kind of like slightly horrifying learning experience that all like avid readers of horrible history books and stuff would have absolutely loved. It's one of those places that wasn't just like any other museum, but it's one that's like proper stuck in my mind and become like a sort of formative memory, you know? It was creepy as hell. So it had these like rooms that were made to look like old streets in like 1800s England and stuff, and they were made to like look and smell dirty and show you all the living conditions, and it was highlighting like the importance of good sanitation and stuff like that. And it had these like horrible like models of people with like dirty faces and like illnesses, and they were disfigured, and they were genuinely horrifying. I'm gonna see if I can like Google it and find some photos, because like this was nightmare fuel. But as a kid, I thought it was brilliant, and it really hammered home the points they were making. At the beginning of the museum, we all got these little cards with like a character on, and we had to follow this character around the museum, and each person was ill, and they were from like different periods in history, and they were from different backgrounds, and they all had different illnesses. And as we went around the museum, we uncovered like another part of their story and like what happened to them, and we learned like how they were diagnosed and how they were treated and so on. And it was really, really interesting. And mine was, I remember it was a green card, and it had a picture of a baby on it, and it's from like the mid 1800s or something like that. And at first I couldn't care less, but by halfway around the museum I was so invested in this baby's life, and I'm like, oh my god, what's gonna happen to it? I was like, I needed to know. I was in there with this baby. I was like, what is wrong with him? I hope he's okay. The parents are worried sick. Ugh. Went through the whole diagnosis process with him. Turns out he had whooping cough, and there was a treatment, and it was a new treatment, and it was experimental, and they were going to try things out, and he started getting better. And I was like, oh god, I was so happy. This was amazing. And then we get to like the last stop on the little museum tour where we find out their stories, and I'm like, oh, they all lived happily ever after. That's what I'm expecting. And then all of a sudden I open mine up and he's dead. My baby was dead. I had spent hours getting attached to this fictional baby, caring about him, following him around the museum, seeing his treatment, seeing him get better, and then he just like had this relapse and died. And oh, like I feel like a little sad now. It still gets me. I don't know what it is. I was so attached to this baby, and then it just went and died on me. It wasn't even a real baby. It was probably like a picture of like some woman who worked at the museum's baby or something, and this is all a fictional story. Oh, it messed me up a bit, I'll be honest. So now when I tell this story, I kind of like laugh about it and joke about it. I'm like, oh, why would they traumatize a kid like that? Like, and it's a bit of a joke. But I do think it taught me a really, really important lesson at the time. It taught me a lot about the realities of what life must have been like back then. It taught me about how infant mortality was incredibly high, and how what we just think is like today, maybe like, oh, a little cough or a sniffle or whatever, could have literally killed you back then. It made me so much more grateful for modern medicine. It made me more grateful for the healthcare that we have today, just in general. And it helped me start to understand and process death a little bit more, so that when my grandma and granny died just like 1 and 2 years later, I think I was a little more prepared for it, and I was able to process it slightly better than I would have otherwise. Because even though it was just a fictional character that I got attached to that died, he didn't even die, he fictionally died. It got me thinking about death and grief and how that is just a part of life. And so I felt not completely prepared, but slightly more prepared when I started to lose people from my own life that I cared about, you know? And in fact, I think books in general really helped me a lot during that time, and kind of like processing my grief and stuff. Especially my granny, because she was like one of the few people in my family that I felt really connected to, and her death kind of hit me quite hard. So books and media like that did kind of help me process my grief and understand it a little bit more at the time, I think. And yeah, I think because of this, just like books and educational materials covering dark and difficult topics shouldn't just be hidden away from kids to protect them. Because in reality, most kids don't have this perfect, easy, sheltered lives. They do have to deal with difficult stuff regardless of their age. Kids who are from dysfunctional families and see money trouble or substance abuse or face abuse themselves, or face bullies, or they get hurt, or they deal with grief, or they question their own sexuality and identity and so on. Like, kids in the real world have to deal with that. And if we shelter them from seeing those things in the media, it just becomes more of a shock to them when they have to go through those things in their own lives, or they don't know how to deal with it properly. They don't develop the kind of compassion and understanding they need to help other people in their lives who are going through that, like friends or classmates or whatever. So yeah, I do think it's important for kids to, you know, see dark and difficult topics. Of course, I think there are some ways that are more appropriate to teach kids than others, but I don't believe that ever involves just banning whole books from teenagers or whatever, you know? I actually covered a lot of this a while back in a video I did on like Jacqueline Wilson books, which wasn't one of my better performing videos, didn't get a lot of views, but it was one that was really, really fun to make. And I revisited a book from my childhood called like The Story of Tracy Beaker by Jacqueline Wilson. And Jacqueline Wilson's amazing because she writes for kids and young teens, and she talks about really, really difficult topics like parents with drug addictions, abuse, kids in care. She wrote a lot about death and grief and dealing with that. She wrote about like struggling with your sexuality. She wrote about kind of like, you know, kids were a bad influence and overbearing parents and all sorts of stuff, like dark topics, difficult topics, but she did it in a way that was still very appropriate for kids and made them feel heard and seen and represented and helped them work through stuff. And I think that was amazing. So if you want to check out that video as well, I'll link it in the video description below. But yeah, I've spoken enough on this topic and I'm getting rambly now. So this is where I am going to end things for today. But thank you so much for watching. Please let me know your thoughts on this topic. Where do you stand on the whole banning mouse debate? Where do you stand on the whole Joe Rogan debate? Where do you stand on the whole topic of like what we should and shouldn't be teaching kids and giving them access to? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. But for now, thank you for watching. I appreciate you a lot and I'll see you again really, really soon.